Okay, welcome back, everyone. Really excited about this next panel, Change and Continuity in U.S. Security Policy. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and my former boss, Dr. Marisa Bross, who's currently the Chief of the Theater Analysis Division at U.S. Southern Command. Dr. Bross.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm honored to lead the first panel discussion of the conference, which addresses change and continuity in U.S. security policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. I wish to thank the Gordon Institute and the Green Center for the unique opportunity of moderating a discussion with 4 Deputy Assistants of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Mr. Roger Pardo-Maurer, who was the Asst between 2001 and 2006, Steve Johnson, who served as Asst from 2007 and 2009, Frank Mora from 2009 to 2013, and Rebecca Bill Chavez from 2013 to 2017. It is my pleasure to share the stage with such a distinguished group, and I look forward to their perspectives on where U.S. security policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean is today, and where it may go in the years to come. In an effort to keep this as a conversation and open dialogue, I asked the panelists to take 10 minutes for opening remarks, and we're going to go in order, and then followed by an open discussion. I want to share with you 4 questions that I shared with the panel members several years ago as a departure for their thoughts. The first one is, what are the most significant changes in U.S. security policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 16 years, which is the time that we have right here in front of us, and what has remained the same? Second question, which areas of U.S. security provide opportunities for improving relations throughout the hemisphere? Third, what is the impact on extra-hemispheric actors on U.S. security towards Latin America and the Caribbean? And last, how do you see U.S. security towards Latin America and the Caribbean evolving in the next 2 to 5 years? It is my pleasure now to turn over the mic to Roger.
Thank you, Marisa, and it's wonderful to have this panel here. You did not explain what we win if we get the right answer. So, and I am reminded of the game show where the contestant was asked, the equator divides the world into how many hemispheres? And the answer was 3. So we don't want that. We want one hemisphere. We want one America that is democratic, free, sovereign, safe, secure, prosperous, all those good things. And as I think of that, the one thing that I see as both continuity and change is right here in this room. I would like for a moment to recognize the 2018 graduates of Florida International. We are here ultimately because of you, and it is to you over there. Yes, you over there. It's nice to have all the rest of you here. But we are here because of you, and nothing that we do will matter if you don't pick up this ball and run with it, if you don't have the passion and the dedication and the interest and the striving for excellence and knowledge and all those things. We're here because of you. And Victor, thank you for helping me clarify my remarks. I also want to thank the distinguished guest military officers here from friendly countries. We're delighted to have you here. My remarks are specifically geared to them, but I will say things that may be of interest to you. To you over there, these over here are practitioners of force. Let us never forget this. We were all deputies, assistant secretaries of defense. Our job is to consider how to use force and, when necessary, to use it. And we did. Each one of us in our capacities had authorities, had to help establish policies that involve the use of force. I want you to keep very clear in mind the distinction between force and violence. We are practitioners of force. We don't want to use force or even the threat of force, but when we do it under law. We do it with rules. We do it planned. We do it the right way. We do not want force to decay into mere violence. And that, I think, is the biggest change we're facing right now in the hemisphere, is that we do have, again, the terrible possibility of a gigantic power vacuum opening in the heart of our continent, and in Venezuela. We must do everything we can to prevent that power vacuum from opening. I want to thank Juan for his remarks. I don't know why you went so light on the Venezuelan regime. I think it is high time for a coup d'etat. I think it is high time for the military to step in and assert their constitutional duties. I think if they fail to do this, the Venezuelan people are perfectly justified and should be encouraged to use force to overthrow this regime that has closed off all peaceful avenues of discussion. But we do not want what happens in Venezuela to decay into violence. And that is why I think a planned use of force that is carefully supported, that is thought through, in which we have really worked out the who, where, what, when, and how is there. Ultimately, it is the Venezuelan people's job to take control of their own destinies. But I think in this administration, in the policymaking community, among you, who will have to deal with this in the future, we have to be thinking of how we are going to step up to this. My experience with Latin America came in the 1980s. I cut my teeth. I joined the southern front of the Nicaraguan resistance, the Contras. And at that time, the southern front was operating out of Costa Rica. The Sandinista regime was perpetrating a genocide against the Miskito Indians. My family is originally from Costa Rica. We have ties with these populations. And the use of force then was the right, honorable, and correct thing to do. At that time, which was the end of the Cold War, in fact, you could say this was the last battle of the last hot battle of the Cold War, there was an enormous infrastructure. And by that I mean a policy, a political, a social infrastructure in the United States, in the free world, of people who had spent their entire lives thinking about how to keep the free world free. As I look around, I don't see that infrastructure anymore. This is one reason this meeting, to you at the tables back there, this meeting is so special. It is so special because it is bringing together right here 15 years of experience from Democratic and Republican administrations. We have not done this before, and yet, if there's one thing that I can leave with you, it is that the key to our success in this region, the reason we're able to look forward to good things, the reason we have partners, the reason things are generally going right in the region is because we were able to work together. I think we in the United States learned those lessons in the 1980s. So the message of continuity and of change I want to give you is that we may be continuity, you will be the change. What we need to do is to find a way for everyone in this room to understand how we need to deal with these problems and work in a civilized way together to find not the least common denominator, but the most effective common denominator. The lesson that I drew in the 1980s from dealing with the Contras was that the U.S. is an unreliable partner. Why? Because it's a democracy. Democracies are not necessarily reliable. You have to bet on their long-term interests and their long-term, their permanent commitment to certain values of human dignity, of democracy, of freedom, and so forth. What I saw in practical life in the Contras was that U.S. policy would change by one vote or by two votes in Congress. Sometimes it supported them and sometimes it did not. It swayed back and forth in the wind. The lesson I took was it is better to do less with a consensus than to try to do more without it. And if you look at how this attitude, which I think all of us share, I don't want to speak for you, but I think just the way we know each other and deal with each other, we share this idea. This is reflected in the success of the U.S. policy in Colombia. It was a policy that is based on Plan Colombia, which was started by the Clinton administration, which was expanded under the Bush administration with the so-called expanded authorities that allowed us to broaden the goals there from a narrow counter-narcotics focus to the actual employment of force, again, force, in helping the Colombian government assert sovereignty over its entire territory. The Bush administration expanded that. The Obama administration continued that. It continues under this administration. This policy, not only is it a bipartisan success, it shows that our national security system actually can work the way it was intended. That's the key takeaway I would like to leave with you, which is that it is better to strive to do less, but that we can all agree on, than more that we do not agree on. I better close at that, but you asked about continuity and change. To summarize my remarks, I am terribly concerned about the opening of a power vacuum in our continent. We must not let this happen. It is high time to remove the Venezuelan regime. It will only be removed by force. Nothing else is going to remove it except the application of force, unless it deteriorates into violence. And it is the Venezuelan military, in the discharge of its constitutional duties, of its moral duties, that can prevent this from happening. And when they do, we must be prepared to help them.
Thank you, Roger. Steve?
Well, that's kind of a difficult act to follow. And, actually, I did have to follow Roger when I became DASD late in the Bush administration. But it's an interesting question, the idea of continuity and change. And on the continuity side, the broad U.S. policies and broad interests that we have in specific parts of the world are fairly constant. And what changes is the ability to engage partners and actually have a relationship in which our friends flourish and they develop capacity. One of the things that, for an odd reason, kind of stuck with me when I came into this job years ago was something that I read when I was in pilot training in the Air Force, and it was in the formation flying manual, 55 something or other. And in this manual, it started out and it said, "The days of going it alone are buried in history." And what it meant by that was that we should learn to fly in formation and be good at that. And that's kind of the way that we approach our relations with other countries, and especially in this hemisphere. And so one of the challenges that I found was that we were just beginning to reconstruct relationships that we had with other countries, specifically with Brazil and having a new bilateral working group, and with Mexico, which had just recently at that time started to come out of its shell, and the Navy Secretariat and the Defense Secretariat decided to engage the United States. And so we formed a bilateral working group with them. And we forged a number of working groups and relationships that began to give us a broader capacity to cooperate and to engage throughout the hemisphere. Now, what this did was it built a sense of solidarity and combined mission. That mission is still ongoing. It's something that Frank inherited and Rebecca nurtured and kept moving forward. But it's very important in terms of supporting other pieces in the engagement strategy that our country has. Now, security strategy is just one piece of the different forms that we have of relating to other countries in different parts of the world. So if we don't have diplomacy, if we don't have economic power and strength, and we don't have a way of dealing with intelligence matters, then the military portion of the strategy doesn't really work very well. But it's very important in these days that we have this kind of engagement, because if we don't, then there are some things that where they're not working will not press forward in a way that they probably should. And what I mean by that is, for instance, we kind of neglect the Caribbean. The Caribbean is important in a number of different ways, not necessarily is in ways because they're important in terms of large populations or in terms of economic strength, but because they have votes in international bodies, because they have a kind of influence in different population groups, the English-speaking Caribbean, the French, and the Spanish Caribbean. So in terms of its solidarity right now, the waning solidarity, but it still continues with Venezuela, it's important that we engage with the Caribbean, that we have different means of being able to relate to those countries so that we can begin to peel them off and build a kind of a solidarity to help Venezuela go in the right direction and some other countries. Difficult to do because Venezuela, through its ALBA and Petrocaribe alliances, had been so successful in bringing them over to their side. And those countries still remember that and remain somewhat loyal, at least in their votes and their solidarity with Venezuela. These are opportunities for us. Southcom can help in that way. Southcom has mobility. Southcom has means of relating to these countries, and it can help bridge that gap, but it's only one player. So we look at security and what we were doing in the Pentagon throughout these years in terms of being one piece of the puzzle and engaging with other countries. Capacity building was something else that we looked at very seriously. Roger, you mentioned Colombia. Colombia, a long-term project, but a very successful one that has not yet concluded. One of the big pieces in that was helping the Colombian armed forces and the police develop capacity to be able to prosecute this conflict to bring two guerrilla forces to their knees. That is still an ongoing process through the peace accords and trying to negotiate a settlement with the ELN and bring the FARC into the political sphere. But that wouldn't have happened without building that kind of capacity. And elsewhere in the hemisphere, we're still trying to do similar kinds of things. But that was just one piece of the equation. Without the support of our diplomats, without the support of economic power in different areas and the free trade agreements that were opened up during the last 15 to 20 years, then the economies would not have been supported in being able to bring the kind of resilience that Colombia needed. The same things are going on now with Brazil. There's an opportunity there to build relations, and we're seeing where Boeing is in contact with Embraer and in talks about merging some operations. I don't profess to have the details on that, but I think that's a good thing to have happen. So to the extent that we've been able to build partnerships and work together, we've been able to advance U.S. interests. Now, in terms of whether there's kind of a military or a security solution to what is becoming the fall of the House of Alba, the Bolivarian countries, I think it's very difficult to say that we have that, but any particular role in that. But what it is, and the reason that we have countries in that alliance and had the rise of dictatorships is, one questioner put to Juan Cruz, is because of a failure of citizenship and a failure of people who were in democracies to be able to stand up and take care of them and act like citizens and encourage candidacies and vote for the right people for office. And now it's come to this where these regimes are very difficult to dislodge. And how citizens are going to be able to do that with outside interference, which is one of the things that Marisa asked us to talk about, I think is very difficult. We have to look at what the influences of the Chinese, who have a lot of loans and certainly have an influence that Evan Ellis is going to talk about a little bit later in his panel. The Russians, who have an interest in being kind of a destabilizing influence within our hemisphere to counteract some of U.S. adventures in other parts of the world. And then other actors that don't necessarily have our best interests and Western democracy's interests at heart. Again, I would say that moving forward through helping to build capacity, being there in exercises, engaging with different countries in the hemisphere, that we can build the kinds of alliances that will keep other countries interested in us, and also help them to come over more to our side in multilateral bodies. And that's a very important thing. But it's all part of a bigger whole, a bigger puzzle in which the many elements of U.S. power come together and have to be mutually supportive.
Thank you. Frank?
Can everybody hear me? Okay, great, thank you. So this issue of continuity and change is something that's really, from an academic standpoint, has been of some interest to me, particularly looking at it since the end of the Cold War, when there was sort of a organizing principle, but with the end of the Cold War, one would expect that differences would emerge, certainly between political parties on our policy. And one thing that I've noticed, and particularly in the space that we're talking about, which is security and defense, that there's been a lot more continuity than change over these 16 years represented here. And Roger and Stephen have already talked about that. When I was appointed to the position, I didn't take the seat for another 2 months. And during those 2 months, the first thing I did was to go see the gentleman here on my left, right? I went to go see Roger. I went to go see Steve, right? And remember, this is from one Republican administration to a Democratic administration. But I felt it was important that I'd meet my two immediate predecessors because the sense I was getting, at least from the incoming administration, that at least in this space, that there was going to be much more continuity. And that's a good news story, right? From one Republican to one Democratic administration. Sure, there are going to be differences. There are going to be differences in other areas, but I think it's important to highlight that when it came to defense and came to security, we had much more in common. There was a sense of national interest that brought the two administrations together. I'll give you a couple of examples. So Steve was talking about the Caribbean. One of the first things, I don't know if Steve remembers, but the first thing that Steve said to me is, Frank, don't forget the Caribbean, right? So I got it, Steve. But when I went on the job, I realized even more what he was talking about, right? And talking to ambassadors, Caribbean ambassadors, and talking to my interagency folks. And one of the first things I did, in memory here of Steve, is to take Robert Gates to the Caribbean, right? When was the last time? I think he was in Suriname. You took him to Suriname. And we went to Barbados. I remember the secretary saying, oh, why are we in Barbados? Well, sir, because of the issues that are facing the United States in the Caribbean. And that if we showed interest, they would focus, and programs and other plans that the administration were continuing, there's a defense side to this, right? And we're going to be meeting with your counterparts from several countries in Barbados, right? And I think just the meeting and the little follow-up they did went a long way to showing the interest that we had that started in the previous administration and continued in the current administration. A lot has been said about Colombia. Everyone talks about how this is a bipartisan foreign policy success story at a time when there are not many bipartisan foreign policy success stories. And Steve and Roger are absolutely right. I think there was continuity, there was actually a deepening of that relationship during the course of that on all aspects, including the area of defense, right? And the administration, Obama administration, continued many of the programs of the previous administration. And one that Steve, I think, alluded to, and I know Rebecca's going to elaborate, is on Mexico, right? The Merida initiative, right? That began at the end, tail end with you, Steve, with the Bush administration. And the Obama administration just continued and doubled down in many ways and expanded our engagement in a whole host of areas, but to include security and defense. So again, sure, we can talk about trade, we can talk about other issues where there is some change, but in this particular space, when it comes to issues of defense, I think there is a consensus. Whether it's building partnership, capacity building, thinking about multinational responses, building the sort of notion of a partner of choice, all these policies, these concepts have continued, and from hearing Juan Cruz, in some ways they're continuing with the current administration. And to me, ladies and gentlemen, that is a good news story when it comes to our policy towards the region, right? We are fighting nowadays over a lot of things. There are enormous differences between the political parties and different groups. But when it comes to this issue, why we are here, yes, there will be some differences, but boy, is there a lot of continuity. And I suspect that will continue. One of the things that when I sat down with Roger, and as you know, Roger's always very entertaining, he poured me a drink and had me for a couple of hours and said to me...
Not just one drink.
One drink. Actually, I had a drink with Steve too. But he, as Roger does, almost sort of looking in your face and pointing his finger and screaming at you almost, said to me exactly what Steve and I had just said previously. These things must continue because we have clear interest in the region. We clearly have mutually accept the challenges that we face. And it's just not administration to administration. It's different governments in the region who see and have a common view of the challenges that we face, whether it's transnational criminal organizations or with the issue of the guerrillas in Colombia, et cetera, right? I think I took that to heart, and I have to say I wasn't, I was paying attention, but I wasn't sure that what he was saying was true, but he was absolutely right. Once I got in the chair, and I may have met with Rebecca before she assumed the job, I said the same thing to Rebecca without the drink and the screaming, to Rebecca that Roger had said to me, even though, again, we came from two arguably very different administrations, which had very different policy on a whole host of issues, but not on this one.
Thank you, first of all, to Florida International University, to Frank and to Brian for inviting me here today. I also want to thank Patty for, I don't know where you are, Patty, but for your patience in arranging all of the logistics, really. So special thanks to Patty. And I also, there's been a mention of diplomats, and there are three here that I worked with very closely. So Ambassador Ayalde, it's wonderful to see you, and I want to thank Ambassador Reineck as well. And then I just saw Ambassador Feely earlier. He's hiding. And it was, here I just want to kind of mention the importance of the relationship between DoD and State Department. And I also, since it's the first time I've seen you, John, I just want to commend you on, I think, what was a very principled decision. So, but most important, I just want to thank Florida International University for the opportunity to share the stage with three very good friends and colleagues. This theme of continuity, I agree 100%, and I think it's going to be a theme of my remarks as well. And I'm going to focus my remarks on Mexico. And what I inherited was actually such a strong foundation. And I inherited it. Roger passed it along to Steve, who passed it along to Frank, who passed it along to me. And I think over time, we've really, together, matured that relationship. So I, unlike these three gentlemen, have actually prepared some remarks. The academic side of me has come back since I left the Pentagon, and so I drafted some remarks on. It is too bad. It is too bad. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Mexico is it's because it's in the NORTHCOM AOR, and also because Mexico has a very important election coming up. And I think it's a great example of the continuity that we've been talking about. So everyone up here worked to really, I think, build a relationship, and I think we've reached a level of unprecedented cooperation on the defense side with Mexico. And that's a relationship I think that the Trump administration has inherited, and I hope it continues to nurture. But because I think of where we are now with Mexico, I think we know what's at stake if there's a downturn. So I want to talk about kind of how far we've come with Mexico and how we got there. Again, each one of us playing a part. So, and I also want to mention here, Ambassador Ayala, you mentioned the importance of connections and geographical proximity and personal and human connections. And I think Mexico is a wonderful example of that and the strength of the connections. So looking at the evolution of our relationship, I think signing of NAFTA was a real turning point for the broader bilateral relationship. And it ultimately resulted in a really important transition of the strategic level of relationship when it comes to defense. I would say it moved ahead in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, definitely, but over time, just definitely progress. And what I saw was determination on both sides and the political will to strengthen ties, to build trust, which is super important in a case where we have such a fraught shared history. So on the Mexican side, there are 5 consecutive Mexican administrations took steps to put the historical animus aside. And on the U.S. side, I would say really Secretary Perry's 1995 visit to Mexico. First time a SecDef went to Mexico. I think that was a really important step as well. And Steve, you mentioned the importance of the defense bilateral working groups. I think the first one was shortly after Perry's visit. But again, this I think is an example of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I think you all helped bring those back and kind of increase the relevance of the bilateral working groups. So what happened is over time, our policy towards Mexico expanded engagement to beyond sort of the narrow counter-narcotics focus, which continues, but it expanded to include more traditional defense cooperation. And I worked under Secretary Hagel and Secretary Carter, and former Secretary of Defense highlighted the advances, recognized, and this was in 2016, and he recognized that Mexico had expanded its traditional role as a regional defense leader and, in his words, is becoming a global exporter of security across the hemisphere and around the world. And I think this theory of security exporting is something that I think we all focused quite a bit on. Colombia with its work in Central America, for example, but Mexico too has emerged as a really important security exporter. It's demonstrating the willingness and the capacity to take on a greater share of the regional and global security burdens. So I want to talk about specifically what we've been doing together over the past, during our tenures at least. And I think what's really important is we all know when we get together with our Mexican counterparts, we roll up our sleeves and we have very frank back and forths in various fora, including the bilateral working group. So you mentioned the opening to Mexico and our collaboration with both SEDENA, the Mexican Army, and SEMAR, the Mexican Navy, has really increased. And we've been able to work together to develop long-term strategic objectives and set priority areas of engagement. So what I want to just briefly tell you is where we were as of the last Defense Bilateral Working Group during the Obama administration. So again, kind of building on this progress. So we sat down with our Mexican counterparts and we identified 2 bins of cooperation. And again, of course, the counter-narcotics is always there, but we identified 2 bins of cooperation. The first was regional security, and this is where it includes Central America. We now work very closely with Mexico on the challenges facing Central America, but also strengthening the Inter-American defense system. And the second bin we labeled global responsibility. And we took this term right out of the Mexico's 2014 National Strategic Development Plan, which designated Mexico with global responsibilities and facing new global expectations. So in this global responsibilities bin, we put peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance disaster response. So I want to just very quickly just comment on each of these categories. So in Central America, as everyone knows, everyone here knows, most migration is not from Mexico, it's from the Northern Triangle, the countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And this is going to continue, and there's not going to be a defense solution to this. This is going to continue as long as these countries face the triple threat of weak governance, the theme of corruption fits in here, lack of economic opportunity, and finally, lack of citizen security. So one of the things we started doing with Mexico is we started to talk about how we could address some of the roots of these problems, and this we did with our interagency. But one piece that we did from DoD is talk about how we can help the countries of the Northern Triangle strengthen their defense institutions, increasing military effectiveness. And if there's time later, one of the programs I think that we have an OSD policy now that's been building over time is this Defense Institution Building Program, which has become, I think, one of DoD's greatest contributions to President Obama's Central America strategy, and I believe is continuing under Sergio de la Peña's leadership. Another example of Mexico's work with Central America is just the fact that in April 2017, SEDENA and SEMAR co-hosted CENSEC with Southcom for the first time, which is really a historical moment. And as the folks at Southcom know, who worked very closely with Mexico, with both SEDENA and SEMAR, they took this job really seriously. Admiral Vasquez Zarate and General Gomez, who were my counterparts in SEMAR and SEDENA, traveled to each of the 7 countries that participate in CENSEC and use their input to help shape the agenda. And from my sense from talking to Southcom folks as well as from our Central American friends, is that this was it led to a really particularly robust agenda at this CENSEC. So Inter-American Defense System, just a couple words about this. Like Central America, we have this shared interest in strengthening the Inter-American Defense System, and this has provided really important opportunities to collaborate, to build mutual confidence, and to grow our defense relationship. Mexico hosted the 2014 North American Defense Ministerial. Secretary Hagel attended. The third SecDef to visit Mexico. Gates traveled to Mexico as well. And this North American Defense Ministerial is becoming institutionalized, which makes me very pleased. I think we were both worried, Frank and I were both worried that it might not become institutionalized, but I think that it's becoming institutionalized. Secretary Mattis hosted it in 2017. Mexico is going to host this year's Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, which is a very significant deal. If you'd asked me maybe 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that that would happen. But here Mexico is playing this important role. And finally, I want to just highlight Mexico's increasing participation in the Inter-American Defense Board. They went from zero permanent staff members in 2014 to over 20 last year. Over 20, yes. Again, kind of,
Incredible.
yeah, very incredible. They also now hold the presidency of the Inter-American Defense Board. General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon were just in Washington, D.C. to commemorate the anniversary of the Inter-American Defense Board. They pledged, I think it was $40,000 it's totally incredible, to refurbish the Casa de Soldado. And really, yes. So they're really stepping up here. And I think there's, by the way, another topic for discussion, but I think there's a lot we can still do to bolster the relevance of the Inter-American Defense Board. But they're definitely working with us on that. Finally, our nascent cooperation in humanitarian assistance, disaster response. The frequent natural disaster challenge in our region represents another challenge to stability, and it also represents another way to bring the hemisphere together. And this, of course, is more urgent than ever as a result of climate change. And the Mexican military is a leading exporter of technical assistance and know-how when it comes to disaster relief. Earlier this month, both SEDENA and CEMAR provided support in Nicaragua in response to the forest fires there. And as host of the Conference of Defense Ministers, they're working very closely with Trinidad and Tobago, with Chile, to develop a hemisphere-wide disaster relief policy. And I very much hope that we're part of that effort. I think I'll stop here, but I do want to say that we can't take it for granted, this close defense relationship. We need to continue to nurture this relationship, and I think we just from what the depth of our cooperation, that a deterioration in this could undermine hemispheric security in areas from illicit trafficking, the networks, to migration and natural disaster-related humanitarian crisis, to destabilizing crime and violence. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. I would like to ask for an applause for our 4 panel members. And before I open up for questions, I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone and make some general observations. In spite of all the consensus that I can feel from the 4 of you, we went from the use of power to the partnering and multilateral approach to security and defense issues in the hemisphere. So there's a lot of differences among the panels, and I'm a little disappointed that there were no fireworks, but maybe I will open it up to questions and see if we can see some ideas flowing. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for getting together and sharing your thoughts. My name is Richard Casares. I'm at Southern Command and a former adjunct professor here at FIU, which I take a lot of pride in. So in the DoD, we usually think about existential threats. During the Cold War, we can argue that we were laser focused on the threat of thermonuclear war and communism. There was a DoD analysis that came out a few years ago discussing global climate change as an existential threat in the 21st century. So my question is about, does the Pentagon play a role in addressing this existential threat? I think one can make an argument that yes, because the implications are absolutely related to our mission set: migration, economic and security, Zika, etc. So does the Pentagon have a role addressing that existential threat? And if not, that's fine too. I mean, do you guys spend time thinking about this? One thing that I've sometimes noticed is that, we talked a lot about today about Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. Are we focused on these day-to-day issues and in effect losing sight of the bigger existential threat? To what extent did you guys, when you guys were in the Pentagon, think about this? What were the conversations about global climate change? Is there a role for the Pentagon? I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Richard. Let me take another question, and then I'll go around. Professor Gamarra?
Okay. Good morning, Eduardo Gamarra from the Politics Department. I listened with great attention to Mr. Pardo, and like usual, I'm impressed by your capacity to generate debate. I wanted to ask you, where in what constitution, other than the Spanish, is there a direct mandate for the armed forces to intervene in politics? And with so much continuity, it seems to me that what you're proposing is actually discontinuity with what has been U.S. policy now for 30 years or so, which is not to encourage military coups. And in a way, aren't you encouraging a military coup and a violation of constitutions throughout the region? And what message are you sending to our friends in the region who have for so long really struggled with the issue of how to keep the military's constitutional role not one of intervention in politics?
Okay, I think we can have them address the two questions because I think there's some kind of connection.
One of the questions was just addressed to him. And he's ready to go.
Losing sight of global threat in the Pentagon, and then the question on Venezuela and...
Okay, if I may address the climate change question very rapidly. My personal opinion is that the environment has been screwing us for billions of years, and finally we have a chance to get even. So I'm not sure that I'm that concerned about the global warming or that we know what to do about it. But there is one very, very real, long-term, short-term, medium-term, important threat that climate change is causing, which means that everybody in the Pentagon needs to get a whole new set of maps. And that has to do with the opening of the Arctic. We are in direct competition with Russia there. There are about 20 nations that have legitimate stakes in the Arctic. This is almost an ungoverned space. It is a legitimate security and defense concern, and we need to address it. That's all I'm going to say about it. Get your map of the Arctic and make sure Greenland is on it. That's going to be very important for us. Eduardo, great to see you again. I speak about coups in Venezuela with a very clear conscience. In 2001, in December 2001, the head of the Venezuelan military, General Romero Rincon, came on a notorious visit to Washington. In my view, he was in the same position that General Pinochet was in Chile in 1972, say. And he was basically trying to take the temperature of what we would do in Washington in the event of a coup. My message to him at the Pentagon, which was reported widely at the time and documented and all, is that I said, President Chavez is the democratically elected, legitimate president of Venezuela, chosen by the Venezuelan people. And I made very clear the United States would not support or tolerate any extra constitutional adventures. And just to make sure that the message was clear, I said, le tengo un mensaje para usted y para los suyos. Nada de golpes, no coups. And I said it in Spanish like that. That was then, this is now. Force, a coup, the military, these are all instrumentalities. What really matters is the sovereign, the people. And in our hemisphere, the people are the sovereign of democracies. This is not what happens in Venezuela. So to me, a coup d'etat would simply be an instrument to bring Venezuela back to the legitimate path that every other country on this hemisphere is or should be on. As for the Venezuelan Constitution, well, you can read it all you like, but one of the things that it does require is that the military defend the territorial sovereignty of Venezuela. I don't see how you can claim that you're looking after your nation's sovereignty when hundreds of thousands of people are leaving, are being literally forced out of the country because they cannot live. So I don't think there's any contradiction with the constitutional mandates of Venezuela. I'm not a Venezuelan constitutional lawyer. I'm looking at this purely from the point of view of the practical fact that we need to avoid a power vacuum from opening in Venezuela that will make Syria look like child's play.
Thank you. Rebecca has a follow-on on the climate change question.
Yeah, I just want to say that it was definitely something during the Obama administration that was something we took very seriously. In fact, and this idea of what are the security implications of climate change was something that we spoke about quite a bit. And in fact, when Secretary Hagel, when he went to the Conference of Defense Ministers in Arequipa, Peru, this is when he launched actually the roadmap, like the Defense Department's roadmap, climate change roadmap, and he launched it there. And I know I attended a Halifax National or Security Forum conference with him as well, and he dedicated his remarks to the security of implications of climate change. And at that time, he focused very much on the Arctic, which you mentioned. And now I would say the other thing that was happening is this is something that the Chileans, for example, are very interested, very concerned about. And it was something that was part of our bilateral dialogue. And it was also tied very closely, and it will be tied very closely the way Mexico is framing it for this Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas to humanitarian assistance, disaster response. So this is something that I think we do, your point about existential threats, that this is definitely one. I'd be very curious to hear about the current administration, given kind of the broader position on climate change, what's going on now in the building. So I'm looking at you, Juan, but I don't know if you know. I'd be curious.
Real quick. So on Richard's question on climate change, if you read that document carefully, it really lays out some of the things that the U.S. military is doing, should be doing, but always in support and in coordination with other agencies, right? Nowhere do at least I recall from that document, that it does refer to climate change and the security threats and challenges that come as a result of the deepening of climate change, and Roger mentioned one, the Arctic, is something that in our bilateral talks were always part of the agenda, and in ways that the militaries are doing in terms of how they structure their force, use of energy, et cetera. So absolutely, we should be, the UD should be playing a role, but always in support of the broader policy perspective. Now, and here I got it, 10 minutes. Differentiate here myself. You know, Roger, we have to be careful what we ask for, right? You're assuming, I think, that the Venezuelan military is an agent of democratic change, and they are not. They could be even allied with others, right? Because we haven't had a relationship with the Venezuelan military for years. But the Venezuelan military, to steal something from my good friend Brian Fonseca, has closer relationship with the Chinese and the Russians than they do with the United States. And I hardly think that they're thinking about bringing democracy to Venezuela. In addition to the precedent problem that I think Eduardo talks about, we have to be careful that there's a different type of regime that can be even more repressive, if that's possible, than the current regime. It could create more chaos. So I think that the option, whether we're talking about military coup or even, as we've heard before, U.S. military intervention, would be counterproductive beyond, I think, our imagination. It could be more destabilizing than we think, and the current dictatorship there is producing. And I think at the end of the day, Venezuelan people require support, our solidarity, the regional support, which is, I think, working better now, but much more than we should expect from them. But this is in the hands of the Venezuelan people. We have to do everything possible to support them. But I think proposing that can create greater problems, because the Venezuelan military is not an agent, a democratic agent of change in that country.
We have time for 2 more questions, but Steve, you wanted to address the climate change?
Yeah, just a quick comment, and I would tend to agree with that. I don't think we know very much about the internal dynamics within the Venezuelan military right now to know if there are any democratic actors or if they're all part of a larger criminocracy that is involved in narcotics trafficking and looking out for their own self-interest. That's one issue. But in terms of climate change, the Pentagon does have, and you probably all remember this, it has a science and technology office.
Yeah.
And although the Pentagon itself does not weigh in heavily on existential matters that would consume an administration at large, it does look at things that would affect its ability to operate and to conduct combat. And so we were looking at alternative fuels for aircraft, looking at different technologies that would allow us to fly and to fight and to float ships with alternative means. And so this goes on, but it's more at a technical level of adapting to different kinds of changes that are on the horizon.
I think this panel is waking up, and we're almost out of time, but Rebecca wanted to make another comment.
Sorry, I didn't have a chance to answer the Venezuela military question, but I just kind of want to highlight Frank's point, and just again that I was alluded to earlier in one of the questions, the fact that both Chavez and then Maduro have made sure that the military is very, very deeply invested in the status quo. Primarily through the use of purges. Juan, you referred to the most recent purge, and also rewards, promotions, patronage, giving the military lucrative positions in government. So I think it's also important to keep that. I mean, they are in bed with Maduro.
Okay, let's move quickly to the last question, unfortunately.
Can we take two questions?
Thank you. My name is Dan Erickson with Blue Star Strategies, and this has been a great panel, maybe a historic panel. I've never seen 4 DASDs in one place. It may never again, depending on the conversation. My question was about budgets. And all of you served during a time when the U.S. was conducting wars in the Middle East, trying to make the case for budgetary support for defense cooperation in the hemisphere has to be difficult, and you've all worked in government, you know the saying, don't tell me what your priorities are, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your priorities are. And so my question is, how did you make the case, given that the fact that the U.S. military is so engaged over the world, that this region was important and worthy of investment, and did you feel like you won more battles than you lost? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, Roger Noriega will remember that I used to go into the budget negotiations of the interagency carried a double-headed battle halberd with a skull on it and bang it on the table when we didn't get what we wanted. It still didn't work, but it was sure interesting to do. Let's not get carried away by budgets. Sometimes a better policy actually costs less and is more effective. And I will cite the case of Colombia as an example. Over the course of 2001, 2003, the administration obtained something called expanded authorities. I've already alluded to this. What did the expanded authorities do? They opened a whole realm of possibilities for U.S. cooperation in Colombia that had been forbidden by law. And to give an example, you had to show that any action or support by U.S. personnel in Colombia was directly associated with the counter-narcotics effort. Well, in real life, what this meant was that if you knew that a mayor was going to be assassinated, or a police station overrun, or a political figure kidnapped, or a massacre about to take place, and you passed this information along, well, you were legally exposed because you could not demonstrate that it was directly tied to the counter-narcotics effort. In fact, we would take you 2 or 3 days maybe to run this by the people who could certify that somehow that it was tied to the counter-narcotics effort. The Clinton administration, to its great credit, pushed this narrow definition of counter-narcotics as far as it possibly could, to the point where it was generating great skepticism in Congress. And finally, with the greatest of all possible ironies, the door was opened by none other than Jeff Sessions, then Senator of Alabama, when he said, hey, this is ridiculous. Why don't we just have a broader strategy? We need to open the door to doing more things. This, without adding in metaphorical budget terms, a single dollar to the defense budget radically enhanced the power of the U.S. support, the U.S. kinetic support to Colombia. President Uribe gives it credit in his book. We were able to provide things like smart bombs, faster intelligence, drones, all kinds of things. So yes, budgets are important, but having smart policies also is. I think that is another example of how our national security system actually worked. I don't necessarily know that if we had had more money in Colombia that we wouldn't have ended up with, say, 100 extra heart of palm factories in the Guaviare, you know? I'm not sure it would have been more effective, so.
We've been allowed to ask, have another question. Evan?
Dr. Press, thank you very much. Evan Ellis, U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. First of all, congratulations on these wonderful perspectives. What a great opportunity to each of the panelists. My question is you recognize that as representing the Office of the Secretary of Defense policy with respect to the Western Hemisphere, one of those important activities was also providing guidance with respect to how our SCO teams, how our engagement could take place with partner nations. As you also recognize that an important part of that, what we call the color of money, is defined through our National Defense Authorization Act. And in recent years, as you recognize, what we can do, how bins of money are put together has changed. And so my question briefly is thinking about how the NDA this year is different from previous. What opportunities do you see in some of the ways that we can now engage theater cooperation activities and some of the things that have been made potentially more difficult? What are the things that concerns you and what are the things that are opportunities for how our SCO teams, how Southcom can engage with our partners under the new NDA?
Thank you. Who wants to go?
Sure. And I'll try to link this with Dan's question on budget. So I agree with Roger in the sense that I think we sometimes focus too much on, how much money do we have to do FMF or the traditional sort of military assistance that we've always had in the region. I think the sometimes impact of those are, quite frankly, exaggerated a little bit. I think we have to think of engagement differently than thinking about how much money do we have to do this or that program, which is not to say that we don't need resources to do the things, but I think we have to be more creative, and this goes to Evan's question. I think Southcom has been thinking in those terms, I think importantly, because they understand that the resources are not there, and that with, I think, policy, and Rebecca talked about the Defense Institution Building Program, and other programs like that that are really what I call real low cost, really high impact in building partnerships and building trust, and that's the key, right? One example, the Inter-American Defense College, right? We're talking about budget dust, right? We're talking very little money, but the number of Latin American military officers that go through that college and have an incredible experience and then go back to their countries to serve in very senior positions, and those relationships that are established and that they remember from their experience in the United States, whether it's the Inter-American Defense College or Fort Leavenworth, are priceless. And it came at a very low cost. And sometimes I find, and I do recall having these battles in the Pentagon, was the days of sequestration, all the rest, we need to cut across the board. And let's cut the Inter-American Defense College, or let's cut these kinds of programs that are just, again, budget dust. You're not going to balance the budget on the basis of cuts to the Inter-American Defense College, but what you're doing is you're breaking off an incredibly effective tool that can bring enormous yield in 5-10 years thereafter.
Okay, Roger, we'll go.
Very briefly, a military is not just a fighting machine. It is a learning machine and a teaching machine, and it is a research machine. One of the things I was proudest of on my watch was the Defense Department, and I'm giving this as an example of the kind of thing you're talking about. Defense has one of the largest, if I think the largest research budget in the world. We were able to establish 3 defense science offices in Latin America, one in Chile, one in Brazil, one in Argentina. sponsored by the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, respectively. Chile is incredible at things like corrosion, minerals. Brazil, of course, their aerospace technology is legendary, world class. Argentina is phenomenal at mathematics and physics. Science has no center anymore in the world. By creating offices there that were sponsoring local scientists, especially in Argentina, where they were broke, our extra dollar had a tremendous payoff there. That's just one example of the kind of thing we can do. The Defense Department has over 200 schools. And as we know, we used to go visit many of them. That is one of the key areas where we can really strengthen engagement and should. Not just the old-fashioned way of bringing people up here. That's great. It's wonderful. As many as we can, but also sending our people there. We have a lot to learn.
Thank you. Steve?
I would say that a little budget discipline is always a good thing. And sometimes when our policymakers have to make decisions at a national level as to where they're going to channel resources, and our Congress does that too, that it can be helpful. And one of the ways that I think, pointing to the example of Colombia, was that we tried to encourage them to develop their own capacity to do maintenance, whereas they were sending helicopter blades back to the United States, which is very costly for overhaul and things of that nature, and engines. Why couldn't they do that there? And so that was one of the things that we tried to plus up, and the other militaries as well. So when there's a deficiency, perhaps that's an opportunity that we can encourage another country to fill the gap. And I'll leave it at that.
Right?
No.
No? Rebecca?
No, just a word on or a couple words on the Defense Institution Building Program, because I think this is the perfect example of a very low-cost, budget dust program that yields enormous results. And it's what I just want to say about defense institution building, and I think Southcom is working very, very hard on this, because it's a difficult thing to do, but when we do it right, it works really well. And I would argue that in our hemisphere, we've done we've done a better job than in other regions. But basically, defense institution building, it's not your traditional train and equip program. It's a much more long-term program. It takes a while. It takes patience. But the idea is, and this gets to your maintenance program, a maintenance point, Steve, is that all of that training and equipment, that it can be absorbed and sustained over time. So what we do is we work with defense ministries to share best practices for defense governance. And it improves the ability to prioritize and plan, and also it really helps with some of the core functions of a defense ministry, which includes budgeting, acquisition, human resource management, logistics. And a country where we've seen great success with this is Guatemala. And I know this is it's not the most sexy program. I mean, but it's in the case of Guatemala, as a result of, it was 5 years of defense institution building of JERI. The government of Guatemala developed its first national security plan, its first national defense policy. It created a vice ministry of policy and planning. And I could go on, but it's an example of a very low-cost program that yields tremendous results.
Okay, lesson learned. We need more than an hour next time. I want to thank you all, particularly to the panel. Thank you so much for your service, and thank you for all the significant contributions that you've made
Mike.
for security in the hemisphere.
Thank you,
So
Mike.
please join me in.
Well done.
And thank you, Dr. Bross, for steering a wonderful conversation. So we're going to take a quick break, but I want to highlight one of the most important, for me anyway, things that Roger said, and that is the future of the national security workforce is back there in the corner, our students. And so I just want to bring your attention to the fact that we have several of our students that have brought their research with them and would really benefit from talking to practitioners about the work that they've done related to national security. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, coffee, research in the back with students, and then we'll reconvene for the next panel. Thank you.